I live in Cutchogue, and I've written a lot about Cutchogue and the North Fork, and including a book about farmers in the North Fork. And at some point during the research of that book, a family up on Oregon Road, the McBrides, one of the members of the family, asked me if I knew Al Petrevich. And I knew his name, I didn't know who he was. And at that point, I got interested in this idea that someone literally disappeared from this town. But it was years later, talking to other people, every once in a while it would come up again, and I thought, boy, this is just one of those unsolved mysteries. I think the question that really kind of haunted me at that point was, why did this happen? Didn't anyone care to find out what happened to her and what became of her? And what could a journalist find out? Either visually through a documentary or through reporting. What could we find out about what happened in 1966? And would it be possible to answer some of those basic questions?
It was the very first meeting that we had with Steve about coming on board to work here at Times Review. We met with him at a local coffee shop, and we're talking to him about, the kind of stories that he would maybe want to tell if he came to work at the Suffolk Times. And the very first thing he mentioned was the idea of pursuing whatever happened to Louise Petrevich. It was that initial interview before he even started. He said, I want to tell this story. This is something that we need to tell. 50 years, this lady's been missing. Nobody's ever done a thing about it. Let's do it.
I think for me, it was really just an issue of, as a journalist, was there a way to find out anything about who this person was? I really wanted to bring her back to life. I wanted people to know who she was, and that she was a person, and that she had an 11-year-old daughter at the time, and that she disappeared. I mean, that doesn't sound like the North Fork. It doesn't sound like the United States. People just don't disappear here and nobody cares. But that's exactly what happened to Louise. She disappeared and no one cared but her own daughter.
She was a very well-liked woman. She was a member of the Cutchogue Ladies Auxiliary. She had a lot of friends. She worked very hard. She picked strawberries. We had a stand in the front of the house, and she would have tomatoes, onions. We'd sell strawberries. And she also would pick strawberries and sell them to the restaurants, the local restaurants. So she was a hard-working person.
Her and I got together pretty good. We always, for each other. I called her Lou, not Louise. She helped on a farm. She worked like for a man that would be doing the work. She'd be doing the same kind of work, lugging bushels of potatoes. There were 60, 70-pound bags of potatoes and something like that, and loaded on a truck. And when we were storing the potatoes like that, she'd be on the truck lugging them potatoes and down the chute. She'd throw them down the chute on the slider. And then it would be my father and my brother and me, down cellar. And because we stored all the potatoes underneath the house and some in a barn. We used to like to dance, and they had a Victrola in one of the rooms, and an old Victrola that you just wound up, And so she'd put a record on and we'd just dance away. And she would come over a lot. And as we got older, we went to the carnival together, we went movies together, and we dated together a couple of times.
Oh, she was a beautiful person. She was a gorgeous person, very pretty, beautiful personality, very quiet. She was like, my mother was very verbose, I guess would be the words for it. I don't know. She was very, she would say what's on her mind. Chechi Lou wouldn't do that. She was just very quiet. She was always quiet.
In 1949, Joe Suhosky, a farmer in Mattituck and Cutchogue, married his wife Margaret, who was always called Beanie. That was her nickname. They were married at Our Lady of Poland in Southampton. And at that wedding, Al meets Louise Jasinski from Sagaponack.
Yes, yes. She was my maid of honor, and she was an usher for him.
He was one of my ushers.
Just 6 months later, they were married in Our Lady of Poland. They had their reception in what's now the Birchwood in Polishtown in Riverhead. But that's where this whole thing begins.
We seldom visited socially, like couples, you know what I mean? And she would come over here, or I would stop in over there once in a while.
Maybe they would go to somebody's house, like Claire and Mickey's house on Saturday, or they would have somebody over to the house, or they weren't much for going out dancing. You know, my father didn't like to dance because he didn't like to sweat. You know, that was him. We'd say, "Come on, Dad, let's dance." "I don't want to sweat." He was just a bundle of joy.
I remember having coffee, or we would go to Dalen's once in a while. Remember Dalen's Market? We would go and have coffee, you know, coffee. I was always going to have coffee.
Or we'd come here.
Yep.
And she'd have coffee with Touchy Claire, and us kids would play or get in trouble or whatever. Yeah. It was, back then, you went and visited with your friends, you know, or she'd get her hair done with Shirley up the street. That's Claire's sister.
Well, moms didn't work back then.
No, the
so that was it.
work.
You know, you did your wash and your vacuumed, you did whatever, and then you'd be like, okay, want to have coffee?
Yeah. Or you went to the beach or whatever. That's how, when it was time to learn how to swim, then we went to the bay to learn swimming lessons, and then you'd stay there for the morning. It wasn't until she started working at Terps, that's when the problems, I think, started, when she started working part-time. I think she wasn't happy because she was physically abused and verbally abused. I would try to protect her, she would try to protect me. So he was just he was a bully. She wasn't an aggressive person. She was kind of a mild woman. She had a good sense of humor, but she wasn't a fighter. She was very meek and mild. She wasn't a fighter. I think if she fought back, it would have been a different story. You know, if she had a temper on her, then it would have been, ho, 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 you know, I better not mess with her. But she wasn't. She cowered. So he had the upper hand. Picking her up by the neck, throwing her up against a wall, cussing at her, and he did the same with me. He was a bully. He was a brute. You were scared stiff of him. You were afraid of him. You were afraid of everything you said, everything you did.
The summer of '66 is really the key turning point in this story. Louise had, about a year before, according to the best estimates, she had left her husband before and taken Sandy and gone to Sagaponack to stay with her father and her uncle and her brother Walter and her sisters. But by the summer of 1966, she's back, and she decides now she's going to leave her husband and go back to Sagaponack with Sandy, and that's it. She's never coming back to Cutchogue.
I remember her writing a note saying, went to Pops with Sandy, took Snooky and the two kittens, and off we went. And then he came and tried to beg her to come back, but she wasn't having it. She said, I'm done.
She opens up a bank account in Bridgehampton and puts money into it. And then she takes the money out in early October 1966.
I remember being in the kitchen, and she came. We were like between the kitchen and the dining room, I guess, like a sitting area dining room. And I remember her showing me 2 plane tickets. I have 2 plane tickets. We're going to Florida, you and I. And I said, oh, good. I've never been to Florida before. Never been out of Cutchogue. I never, you know, we didn't go anywhere. Never traveled. The World's Fair was about the only big place we ever went. But and I said, oh, good. And that was that. Yeah, we're going to Florida. Never said when, tomorrow, next week, or whatever, but we're going to Florida, you and I. And that was that. Never materialized.
Sandy says that her mom came to her, showed her plane tickets, and said, I'm taking you to Florida. What we know is that there was money withdrawn from this bank account. Bank account was closed on October 3rd. That tells me that Louise had plans to go somewhere. She was using that money for something. Maybe that money was to purchase these plane tickets that she showed Sandy. What I don't believe is that they were meant for Sandy. If I were to guess, I would say that the names on those plane tickets were Louise Petrevitz and William Boken.
Several people had told me, including a former town police officer, that the rumor always was that she'd had a relationship, an affair with a town cop.
William Boken grew up in East Marion, not far from where Louise Petrevitz lived with her husband in Cutchogue, New York. He was a Southold Town police officer. He joined the police department in 1957. He was a patrolman. Based on some of the press clips that we found about him, it seemed like he might have worked a lot of overnight hours. He made headlines a couple times, one for being the first on a scene of a fire, another for he was involved in the arrest of Joan Crawford's son. There's no doubt that Louise and Bill Boken were together. I mean, her own daughter says, I was there in the car, saw them together meeting on Harbor Lane. He was known to spend some nights at Louise's parents' house after she had left Albin.
My mother kind of rendezvoused with him down Harbor Lane one time, and I was in the back seat, and I remember seeing him. I said, my mother's seeing another guy.
I said, Dick, do you remember this case? And he says, the one from Cutchogue? And I says, yeah. He said, I remember it well.
Everything was a big secret back then.
He didn't care if his wife was alive or dead.
I left her on the streets of Brooklyn.
There was no doubt in his mind that Bill Boken was responsible for the murder and disappearance of Louise.